Welcome to the 52blu podcast, brought to you by Concertfy. Experience music. Today with us we have Jared Prokop, who is here in Los Angeles, coming from London, where he currently studies at the Royal Academy of Music. He has been studying there since 2015, working on a bachelors of music in classical double bass performance. So welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And we want to go over a couple of things that you've done.
Sure.
I'll do a brief introduction here. You have been working at the Royal Academy of Music in London.
Yeah, that's correct.
And you have been living there for the last 4 years.
Well, 3 years.
3 years.
I've got one left.
Okay, perfect. And you studied here in LA at the Palisades Charter High School.
That I did.
And graduated in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
Don't mean to date you, but that's the date. And then you have been performing as a professional double bassist for the last 5 years.
That's correct.
Working with both the Los Angeles and London. Is it the Philharmonic?
No. I mean, smaller scale sorts of things, really. Not.
Okay.
I haven't played with the London Symphony Orchestra or anything massive like that yet.
Okay, but I do have here Academies of Contemporary Music scene, debuting with the Manson Ensemble.
Yeah, that's part of my school. That's their contemporary music ensemble, who we have guest conductors in who are pretty prolific and things like that.
Okay, and I do have a few names here. I don't want to just drop all of them, but most of these include, let's see, we've got Semyon
Bichkov. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to mispronounce those. And
Okay.
Christian Thielemann.
Yep.
They work where exactly?
Well, they work with a number of different orchestras all around the world, usually as guest conductors. I don't think they're residents anywhere. I might be wrong. So, but they've worked with the Berlin Phil, London Symphony Orchestra, you name it. They've probably conducted that orchestra. But
okay, well, we'll dive a little bit into that.
Sure.
But then, in terms of skills and instruments that you play, obviously the double bass is going to be your main instrument, but you also do electric bass, piano, and you do jazz chart reading and improvising.
Yeah, I can hang a little bit when it comes to jazz playing, but it's not my specialty. Classical is what my degree is for,
and when you play, do you play in different types of ensembles that play jazz music as opposed to classical music, or is that something that you've trained in but not necessarily played?
Well, I have a couple of people that I like to jam with and to just mess around with. Really, a couple of people here in LA who, whenever I'm back, I'll hang out. We'll play a few standards and things like that, and but nothing too serious. Haven't done any jazz gigs or anything like that. But yeah, no, I suppose
that's cool. Yeah. That's actually again, I haven't said this in the podcast in this episode, but I'm an aspiring, struggling musician, and the mixture of classical music and jazz has always been something that I find interesting when either those are fused together or the artist can play on both sides of that spectrum.
I mean, they're completely different approaches to music making.
Classical seems to be very well structured, very rule driven.
Yeah.
Jazz is improvisation, feeling the rhythm, and then going with whatever the beat.
Yeah, usually. I mean, you have to with jazz and classical respectively. With jazz, you need the whatever technique to be automatic. You can't be thinking about it on the fly because there's too much going on at that at any given moment. But with classical, it's quite the opposite, because you've played this one little line probably 200 times, and you have to meticulously measure out, especially with stringed instruments, the bow distribution, the weight, the speed. And
do you find yourself when you're playing the double bass in that type of environment that the harder part is coming in on cue and hitting your notes right, or is it what do you think is a bigger challenge in that type of scenario?
Well, I think it's often I'll have kind of an idea that I'm working on a piece. I'll have an idea of how these phrases should go, and normally can execute them pretty decently on the fly. But the issue is that if you really want to get it with extreme dynamic contrast and all these little nuances that make these phrases so pretty, you have to constantly just repeat everything over and over again and meticulously measure out what you're doing with your bow. It's very counterintuitive because, as much as I'd like to just sit down and play my instrument, I can't. I have to sit down and I have to focus and I have to measure out all these little details in order to get the phrase across.
Now, do you feel when you're playing your instrument that your sound signature goes through that, or do you have to make an effort to accommodate to the director or whoever you're playing with to make sure that it is more of their soundscape or flavor instead of yours?
Well, I mean, everyone's got their own individual sound. I was talking more about solo playing.
Okay.
But in an ensemble, right, you have to blend with what the other instrumentalists around you and things like that. And normally, if a conductor isn't happy with what you're doing as a section or as an individual, he'll be able to hear it and he'll kind of point that out and he'll say, here, do this way or do this that way. And then you just
adapt to that.
Mark a little thing in the score, in the music, and it should be fine. But
do you prefer one or the other when it comes to playing any piece or written piece that is not your original?
I mean, you mean between ensemble playing and solo playing?
Yeah.
I think both are very important. I kind of like solo playing a lot, but with the double bass, unlike if you're a violinist or a cellist, being a soloist is very much an option. That's a professional route you can follow through with. But with double bass, there's maybe two bassists two bassists in the entire world that make their living off of solo playing.
Oh, okay, got it.
So, orchestral playing is kind of our bread and butter, and teaching as well. It's we don't eat unless we do either of those things, really.
So it does have a very specific career path, if you want to call it. When you go into double bass. Sure. Well, I mean, there's got to be a ton of other instruments that fall in that category. But
right. Yeah.
I do understand the perception, at least in the public, of a violinist or a cello player being able to stand on their own or playing whatever they want, as opposed to somebody who has to play either in an arrangement or an ensemble. Yeah. And or that can't easily just pop out and say, I'm going to play a solo part.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's more just, there are way more concertos written for other instruments, and there's more of a market for that sort of thing, whereas the people who want to hear solo double bassists are double bassists. Yeah. So there's that.
A niche market.
Yeah.
Let's leave it at that. Okay. I do want to touch a little bit on your history and path in the music career and or field. So I wanted to ask you, how did you get into music? Or how do you go from, just getting into high school and choosing to, very specifically go into the music field, whether at that point you knew it was going to be double bass or just music in general?
Okay. Well, I'd been taking piano lessons with David Nunez here for quite a while. And back in elementary school, they offered a free violin program, and I hated it. I really did not like playing the violin, but my mom made me continue with it. And in addition, both my grandparents are musicians as well. My grandfather was a cellist and grandmother was a violinist, and they both worked professionally. So music had kind of always been around me. But yeah, I got to middle school and my mom put me in the orchestra, and I was like, "Why did you do that?" I really didn't want to continue doing this. But so we got there, and they had no double bassists. And I was going to play violin. I wanted to switch. I really desperately wanted to play cello or something else like that. But they had no double basses. So I volunteered and, messed my way through that, kind of not really knowing exactly what I was doing. But they had a coach there who would come in every week and give us kind of group lessons, so to speak. And eventually I started studying privately with him, Frank Coglatori. But he also is an electric and jazz bassist as well. So I kind of this is where, I have kind of both backgrounds here. So he taught me how to do either side of it, And then getting into high school, I really couldn't do anything else. Like I got good grades, I had pretty high GPA and stuff like that, but I don't know, part of me never really wanted to work in an office or do anything.
9 to 5.
Yeah, I just, that didn't resonate with me in any way. So I thought about, options and things like that. And, arts had always fascinated me. I'd always loved film, and music has always been kind of there. And at this point, I think I was about 16, I think it was my mom who was like, oh yeah, you have to maybe consider your other options. Like, how are you going to get like scholarships at schools and things like that? And then one of the options was to take bass more seriously and to start studying with a new teacher. And I started studying with David Young at the Colburn School in downtown LA. He's a principal bassist of the LA Opera, or he's retired now, but used to be. And through that, things started to make more sense, and he definitely gave me a good foundation to kind of start with, and I studied with him for about 2 years, and then came the time for college applications and things like that. So I auditioned, and he told me how overly ambitious some of the places that I wanted to apply to was, because I applied to 22 schools, or quite a few.
National and international.
Yeah, national and international. I didn't actually plan on auditioning for the Royal Academy, or I also auditioned for the Royal College. And a friend of mine who had gone to a drama conservatory in London said to me, he's like, oh yeah, you should, it's got good music schools here, apply. That'd be. And I was like, sure, why not? I thought
just
it couldn't.
One more application.
Yeah, one more audition. And so in preparation for that, I think was when I kind of really started to find, not my sound, but momentum, I guess, with playing music. And so doing all these auditions and traveling across the country, because it's weird. You have to go everywhere just for one day at a time and warm up on a bass you've never played before and play
in the audition process.
Yeah. So for universities and stuff like that. So that was quite fun, and I got into the academy, and I had no idea. I didn't think I would. And I figured, why not London,
Yeah, absolutely. Why not? So that I do have, I guess it was meant to be 2 questions, but I guess we can combine it into the one.
Sure.
Because I'm assuming it's going to be somewhat related from what I'm hearing. But would you consider that there was a specific moment that was a defining, okay, this is music in my life, and I get the sense that comes from what you just explained. But in addition to that, and not trying to make this sound like it's an unfair question,
sure.
But do you feel the fact that double bass was your instrument that helped or benefit in getting into, if not getting into the Royal Academy, but just in general, that it's an instrument that is not going to have a lot of competition?
You're right in that respect, and that was kind of part of the reasoning, or my reasoning behind choosing it. But I mean, I didn't actually think about it at the time, because I was in middle school when I first decided to switch to the double bass and started taking lessons. So I wasn't thinking that far ahead. But in the sense that, yeah, there are less double bassists, say, compared to violins, that's fair. But equally, there's equally the sizes of each of a violin program versus a double bass program are proportionately smaller and larger. So they have more openings for a violin program versus a double bass program. So it's not...
Okay. Odds are somewhat similar.
But definitely in favor, because the double bass is a very technically challenging instrument to get around. So in order for to stand out is quite it's relatively easy, whereas you have a lot more higher level players in violin or other instruments. So.
Got it. Now, obviously, it from what you're explaining, I see that there were a lot of things that were kind of coming into play, forming the path that you were going to take ultimately. But, and especially for aspiring musicians and or other students that might be listening, what do you think were I'm going plural here, but it might be a single thing, but the biggest adversity in trying to get into this career path, whether it was on a double bass or just music in general? What would you think in your experience was pushing back or creating havoc?
Practice. The idea of having to every day go back and run through the same sort of things over and over and over again it was a little mind-numbing to me at first. I hated it back before I started studying with David Young, and I would, you know, my mom would be like, you have to practice right now, and I'd be like, sure, and she'd leave and I'd put it down. I'd go and watch some TV or something, right. And then she'd come back and I'd pick it back up as though I'd been working the whole time. But there was a certain point where, you know, it's almost like, oh God, I don't want to say it, but meditative. It's really kind of rewarding in a way to work at something and slowly see progress. It's, you know, because there's a huge benefit to that. I think you see something that, you know, was so insurmountably difficult at first become easier and easier and easier, and eventually you start to have fun with it. And it's a very slow, grueling process, but once you do that a few times, then you see that there's a point to the daily kind of, yeah, absolutely.
Do you feel certain pieces of music would either encourage you to keep practicing as opposed to music that you were like, oh, I don't like this piece, I'm done? Or was that general feeling of like, you know, feeling kind of stuck? Because I know how that practice stage works, where you're like constantly working on the same thing, and then you get to the point where you're like, I'm done, I don't want to do this anymore. So do you think it was beneficial to have certain types of, you know, written music that you were practicing on, or was it just a general feeling?
I think it's important to play music that you like, you know, otherwise I think it's at a certain point it's also important to play music you don't like, because that's part of the process, being able to sit through something that you don't really want to play but have to, and go through that same process with the same enthusiasm almost that you would something you really enjoy. That's further down the line, but I think definitely starting out you need to have something that you really enjoy putting the time into. So that, sorry.
No, that's actually exactly what I imagined.
Yeah.
Especially because I want to bring up the point that obviously when you're middle school, high school, attention span isn't going to be your best friend.
Right.
So that definitely comes into play, and I'm assuming that trying to take something serious doesn't quite kick in until you get to a certain point, either with the ability in the instrument, playing the instrument, or mentally at a stage where you're a little bit more mature and go like, okay, this is a thing, I'm gonna go with that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because other instruments might have a different flair to them that may be more encouraging. You know,
well, say piano for example, right? There's not this ridiculous technical gap that you have to bridge. It's just you press a key and sound comes out, and there, you can, not to, you know, dismiss pianists, but it's just starting on something like the double bass is much more frustrating in a way, because in order to actually make a nice sound, that took me like 5-6 years of just work to be able to make a sound that I was actually happy with. But, you know, I didn't realize it at the time, but as you get better, your ears get better and you can hear what sound you're making. And
well, it is an instrument that requires more, like you said, technical ability.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people give that credit to string instruments, where the positioning of the bow, the pressure that you're putting on the bow, on the string, all that factors in how the sound comes out.
Yeah.
As opposed to, like I said, a piano, you know, has its benefits in the, you can modulate the sound, of course, by how you press and, you know, techniques.
Yeah,
but
sure.
It's different.
It's a different kind of coordination, right. But for example, like intonation is something that pianists don't really have to worry about, whereas that's, oh my God, I can't tell you how many hours I've just spent practicing the same run over and over again, trying to get everything perfectly in tune, because it's just, especially on the double bass, you know, you're dealing with, I don't know, 2 meters of fingerboard length, whereas, you know, violin's much shorter, so it's just, the gaps are massive, and it, especially with double bass, it requires an incredible amount of just strength in your left hand to be able to actually play, and you don't get that. Not at first anyway, not for a while. But
and I would like you to talk just a little bit about this particular thing, because I don't think a lot of people that haven't played a string instrument, both as big as this one and or with the specific characteristics, going into its I guess, more popular counterpart, which is a guitar. These are fretless instruments. So
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit or explain a little bit about the challenges of playing with a fretless neck or body that requires precision, like you said, in getting the right note?
Well, I suppose with frets, you have them all kind of in front of you. You can see where each note is and where you're meant to put your fingers, but that has to be in your head. You have to have every note kind of mapped out on every string, and you have to know exactly the distance in your between your first and second and your second and fourth finger that makes a half step, so to speak. And if as that changes as you go up, because as you go higher and higher, or lower technically down the fingerboard, the
higher and top. Yeah.
The gaps get smaller and smaller, so you have to adjust to that. And build that into just your muscle memory, and it's a grueling process. It really is.
I imagine. I mean, when I double with a guitar which has frets, it's like I have to look at the frets to know which finger is going where.
Sure. No
frets is just mind-boggling to me. I have mad respect for anything that involves a fretless neck there. So that's good to know. I think a lot of people will like that information and or tidbit. Now I do want to touch on we talked about getting into school and getting into that, but the formative experiences that you had both in the high school stage and then moving into going over to London and then getting into the Royal Academy, how, I guess, I'd like you to talk about the differences in those formative experiences, because there are very different levels and or stages both in life, but also in terms of the I want to say how advanced your playing skills are going to be.
Right.
So could you talk a little bit about the differences in those experiences?
So I found when I was working in LA before I had gone to London that I felt like I knew how to play the instrument more. I felt like I had a better grasp of it, but that was, of course, not the case. But I worked mostly with more with musicality, more with phrasing ideas and actually playing music and knowing how to play in time and in tune. But there's a whole other technical side of, especially with your bow, that I was almost completely unaware of. And when I got to London, that was the only thing that we did for about a year. Was they said, you can't, no pieces yet. Open strings for 2 weeks, every day for about 3 hours. Because there's a coordination, a relaxation that comes with using your right hand that you understand as a younger musician that you're meant to pull the bow across the string, and if you move it faster it gets louder, and if slower, and if you get having the right technique, the right bow grip, and being, most importantly, really relaxed, which sounds so simple, but I still struggle with that, because as you play, you get tense, and being able to, realize when you are and aren't tense is almost essential to playing the bass, especially, as when you're a younger bass player, I suppose, I don't know, I'm sure this is similar to all string instruments, but you play quite near the fingerboard because there's less resistance. It's much easier to pull it across. You can move it. It doesn't have to be exactly parallel, and it'll still make a pretty okay sound, but if you really want to play loud, you have to get closer to the bridge, and that requires, it's like a balancing act. If there's any misplaced weight or it's not quite parallel to the bridge, or you're moving it too quickly, the sound will just, it'll cut off, and you won't be able to even make a sound. So being able to play down there requires that relaxation and this attentiveness that I definitely didn't even know was really a thing until I got to a conservatory. So
now, do you think it would have made it any easier to have those I guess it's kind of hard, because when you master an instrument, you fine-tune your own hearing to listen to those either mistakes or technical aspects that make it sound one way or the other. But do you think that that is something that you could have either had or learned at a younger stage, or do you think that in the process of mastering your instrument, that was, maybe the appropriate time to get into that after the different techniques or practices that you were doing before that stage?
I think it's good to try and understand some of these things, but equally, I think that's part of what those later years are for, is for, completely destroying your technique and rebuilding it up. But I think the most important thing for younger musicians to focus on is have this idea of what you want something to sound like in your head, and being able to sing it back to yourself and reproduce it on your instrument. You don't need to be a technical genius to do that. And that's a skill in and of itself. And it doesn't require technical prowess, but in order to get it exactly the way you want it to sound, eventually it does require that. But I think just that's what a lot of conservatories are looking for, weirdly, in auditions. They're not necessarily looking for you to be the most technically gifted. They're looking for that ability to kind of come up with interesting ideas and be creative in that sort of way.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to a couple of follow-up questions that I have. And it might be more curiosity on my end,
sure.
But typically an instrument always kind of follows maybe the instrument itself doesn't follow, but somebody that's trying to get into music or whatever will have a preconceived image from somebody who has played the instrument or is your idol. So first question is, where did you find the like inspiration / aspiration to follow somebody that plays a double bass like that you were like, okay, that's inspiring me to be better or to play like that, kind of like a role model in a sense?
Sure. Well, I didn't really have this serious double bass aspirations until probably I got around to high school, because before I would have loved to have played in a band, and I did play in a band for a while. So Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers was someone who I really looked up to and admired, because he was an amazing electric bass player, and he really inspired me to get into it. But then as I grew up, got into high school and got more into upright bass, I started exploring that kind of field. And one of the people who I really, really, really enjoyed was Edgar Meyer, and he's arguably one of the best bass players to ever live, really. And he's still alive, which is most instruments, they've come and gone, but the best instrumentalist is currently still with us and teaching.
And you've been able to work with him?
He came to the academy and he gave a master class. I wasn't in the master class, but I was able to listen, and I recorded it and can revisit that whenever I want to. And that was I mean, this is kind of off topic, but with academy, that was one of the most extraordinary parts, is the guys that they brought in are some of the best I've ever seen in the entire world. And being able to just spend 30 minutes just asking them whatever, it opens up so many doors. But going back to Edgar, he also, I find him very interesting as a character, because he definitely did not take the normal path. Didn't play in an orchestra. He wrote a lot of his own songs, and he grew up I think in Tennessee and he listened to a lot of folk music, a lot of like fiddle playing, a lot of that kind of stuff. And I don't know how true this story is, but apparently he entered like a country fiddling contest, and there are hundreds of violinists and one double bassist, and he won it. He won it, yeah. So I think it's interesting that he came from that kind of a background, and he still to this day plays a lot. He improvises with a bow with such virtuosity that I've never seen anyone ever do, really. And he's played the Bach suites, the Bach cello suites are something that bass players have more recently picked up as a way to really push our technique, because playing it at the same pitch as a cello requires virtuosity and thumb position and relaxation of the bow that's just kind of unheard of. But he's someone who I've never heard anyone play that cleanly.
Yeah, because I imagine at the lower end of the is it called the neck of
the neck. The neck.
Yeah. You don't have the ability to use your thumb as counter pressure, right?
Yeah, but you come up on the top and actually you use the thumb as a finger itself. So the thumb, you have more range higher up than you do down here because you only have 2 half steps to work with versus there you have
a little bit more.
Yeah.
Okay. That's 4, something I didn't even know.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Okay, I want to touch base on a couple of the specifics of those experiences that you had, and I think you kind of touched base on that, but what were the parts that you most enjoyed over the last few years, specifically at the Royal Academy, and the ones that you didn't? Now that we've moved into a phase where, or you've moved into a phase where you're, this is your instrument, so there's no like I'm getting bored, like this is the thing. So what do you think are things that were good and inspired you to keep going, and things that were difficult and hard to get past?
I mean, definitely, turning up in London and having at least some faith in my ability, and then having that just kind of ripped away was shocking to me. But and then at a certain point you're just unhappy with every sound you make, because you've heard your teachers who were these incredible music, Graham Mitchell, principal of the ENO, Dominic Seldis, principal of Concertgebouw, and Tom Goodman, he's in the LSO. You've heard these people just, oh my God, and suddenly you're listening to yourself and you're like, wow, this isn't that good, is it? So you're constantly, in a weird way, comparing yourself to these amazing players, and that's good and bad in a lot of ways, but it's good to strive towards that, ideally. So I think being able to get past that technical gap, so to speak, was very much a struggle. And I'm very thankful I'm past that, for a lot of other reasons. Some of the most pleasant things that I recently went on tour with the Academy's soloists ensemble, and we worked with the Tokyo Gaidai. It's a conservatory in Japan. They're from the Tokyo University of the Arts, and half the orchestra was made up of Academy students, and half the orchestra was made up of students from Tokyo. And they came to London, and we did a series of concerts playing Beethoven's Third Symphony and a couple other things. And we toured all around London and went to Oxford and did a concert there, and then we all flew to Japan and did a bunch of concerts there. And I think that was one of the most extraordinary things. And working with the conductor Trevor Pinnock, who's not on that because it's very recent. I haven't added it to my CV yet, but it's a different kind of, and I want to kind of compare it to another conductor that I've worked with, because this was very much positive reinforcement. You didn't, often in an orchestra, you're petrified because the conductor is going to point out, oh, you played this wrong, or you played this out of tune, and you're afraid that they're going to make you play it in front of the rest of the orchestra, because it is quite, and especially if you can't do it right, it's quite embarrassing to, play something wrong in front of 60 of your colleagues. Being exposed like that, yeah. And working with Trevor wasn't like that. It was, he'd stop and he'd say, just relax, let the music flow. Don't try and control it so much. And it'd give people the confidence to play out, which often you don't have a lot of the time. You're afraid to, because you're afraid of it being wrong. But it's great to have that kind of, not arrogance, but just not being afraid of what other people would think, or etc. And then I want to kind of touch on another thing that the Manson Ensemble, which you spoke of before, my experience with them was I filled in, a bass player dropped out, and they needed someone to play, so I volunteered, and I was working with this conductor and pretty prolific composer who has recently passed away, and my prayers go out to his friends and family, because he was such a momentous figure in contemporary music, and I had it was an extraordinary pleasure to work with him while I had the chance. Oliver Newson, and working with him was very different, and in a good way as well, but in a much more frightening way, because Ollie had better ears than any conductor I've ever worked with, And I wasn't playing with a section. I was a lone bassist playing a bunch of contemporary pieces that have very difficult time signatures and extended techniques that I'm not familiar with. So I, every time I was out or lost or played something wrong, he'd stop, look at me, and, be like, why are you playing this wrong? And he couldn't really comprehend why, but that's because he's such a gifted musician himself. But it was very, very different to working with Trevor, because it was, quite opposites. In one, you wanted to just play everything out as loud as you could, and in the other, you were quite hesitant because you wanted it to be so precise and so right and in tune and with everything else that it was. You get in your own head in a weird kind of way, and I think that's also one of the harder parts about being a musician. You overthink things like a lot of the time, and sometimes it's just more important just to listen and just to feel the rest of the ensemble is, because you'll never really be wrong if you're actually just paying attention to what's going on. And I mean, of course, you need the technical ability to play in tune, and that's just practice. That's just sitting in a room with a tuner and doing scales. That's just time and energy. And eventually everything will become easier through doing that. But I think it's important to positive reinforcement, so to speak. It encourages musicians to go places they haven't before, and not to play within themselves, but to really shine.
Expand,
so yeah, sure.
Would you say, having said that well, I guess the question is, I'm going to say a multiple choice question, but who do you think it would be harder to play for? I'm trying to make sure that the question is right, but do you think, maybe not the ultimate critic, but is it harder when you're playing to yourself, like meaning because you're so conscious of what you're doing, to the conductor, or to the general public who is there to, might not be as technically inclined to say, oh,
Sure.
This is played right or wrong, unless it's something very obvious. But what puts more pressure on your playing? Is it yourself, the conductor, or the public?
The general public are weirdly easy to play for, in the sense that they don't necessarily know what's the finer points of classical. I mean, as a musician, I can hear, when someone stops their vibrato and shifts and then starts it again. It's just these weirdly crazy specific things. I think the most intimidating thing is playing for other bass players, especially good ones, because they not only understand the finer points of playing classical music, but they play your instrument and they can see exactly what you're doing. So I think that playing for your teachers and your peers is the most frightening thing, but I think it's crucial to do that constantly, because then playing in front of a regular audience or a conductor becomes that much easier, because you've played in front of the most critical audience you can.
Do you find it hard because that is a very common thing that happens as a classically trained or a classical music performer, that if you're playing a piece, the piece, and you've played it one way under one conductor, and then by chance you play that same piece under a different conductor, is that, for you, or from your perspective, is that difficult to cater to the other, one conductor's, feeling with the piece, or their energy, or
Sure.
or is it just as equally easy or hard to do one or the other?
Well, I'd say the second time you play, say, a difficult symphony or something like that, it becomes substantially easier to play. But that is then the challenge is to adapt to what the conductor is doing, and in that sense, that's challenging. But it just requires thought, because often conductors will disagree on tempos or where exactly climaxes should be within that movement or whatever. But just paying attention and kind of being there and listening and being aware of what they're trying to tell you, I think is It's quite difficult because, I mean, especially if you're concerned about if you're playing in tune or together with the rest of the ensemble, there are tons of things to kind of be worrying about at the same time. But yeah,
it's kind of hard to mask your own mistakes, right?
Yeah,
When you're
sure.
so conscious and other people are also listening to both your cues, you're playing. I'm assuming it's got to be a little bit different than a 4-piece band or something like that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, in a way that's in a way more exposed because you're plugged into an amp and you're, if you play anything wrong, then pretty much everyone can hear you. But in a section, strangely, if you make a mistake, generally speaking, and I'm not saying that it's okay to, but you can get away with it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's why, I mean, the smaller the orchestra, the more exposed you are. So that's why chamber music is kind of also such an important part of classical music, because that's, a quintet or a quartet that's just for individual players.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to really, keep the flow of things going, you have to be so confident in your part and what you're doing that, it allows that. Yeah,
thank you. Talking about doors and opening of
Mm-hmm.
doors, you have worked, to me this is fascinating, but at Abbey Road
mm-hmm.
a couple times. So what were those opportunities and what did you get to record in those series?
The Abbey Road thing sounds more exciting than it was. Basically, a singer at Academy was producing one of her own albums, and she had been in contact with one of the producers at Abbey Road, and they needed string samples for that album. And so, strangely, this was a good bonding experience between me and my roommate, because they initially called him. He's a bass player, but he's a jazz bass player, who I still live with him now. I think that's also been a crucial kind of thing in exploring music, is having that influence, as well as a good friend of mine's a contemporary composer. So we've got kind of a bunch of different things, and we show each other music, and I think it's important to listen to everything. But as you were saying, with that Abbey Road thing, so he got contacted by this singer to go and do that session, but he knew it would be all bowed stuff, and we have very different techniques, and he'd be, if it was like a jazz album, or he had to do upright bass samples with pitching, or he would be the ideal candidate for that kind of thing. But he and he knew that that's something that I had really wanted to do for a long time. Studio recording and session playing is just, that has always seemed so great. So he let me do that, or gave me that gig, and I went, and that was my first time recording there. I've done it a couple times since, working with students from the Abbey Road Institute, Arthur Navarro and a couple of other people who had all been producing their own albums, and again, they just needed a bass player to record samples for whatever it was. So you just walk in, sight read some music, and do it until it sounds good, and then you leave. And that's quite cool, just hanging out in that kind of a place. It really is, just sitting in the studio and just, I could do that for forever, really. But that was my time there. I thought that was really fun, actually. I really enjoyed that.
And then that was not related to, and I do want to jump into the recording credit that you have for That's How I Got to Memphis, the HBO series. Is that track, or?
That was the name of the song. It's a Tom T. Hall song, and the name of the show is The Newsroom. Mm-hmm. That was on HBO, and that was very interesting. I was about 16 at the time. This was before I was auditioning for college, and out of the blue, I got this email from the producer of the show, or the casting agent of the show, and apparently one of the executive producer's sons was a bass player and had studied with my teacher David Young at the Colburn School, and they needed, for whatever reason, for this particular scene, a 16-year-old bass player who could play a song and read lines, and that was the scene. I don't want to spoil the show for anyone who might watch it, but it's the very last episode, and it was absolutely insane just to be on a set and hang out with people like Jeff Daniels, and who else was there? Olivia Munn was there. Jane Fonda was also like, it was just kind of strange being on a set, and that was my first experience acting or doing anything like that, and naturally they wanted to re-record a lot of the instrumentals and vocals in post-production. So on that, I had to go in another day after filming all the scenes and then record and
we're doing it again.
Yeah. So that was also quite fun.
And much younger than I thought. I thought that was more recent history.
No, that was.
I know the show's been out for a while, but
yeah.
I just thought it was a little bit more closer to now.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. Okay, so getting into what you are currently doing now, are you living here in LA? Are you based in London, or do you go back and forth enough to say you're in both places?
Well, I'm in LA now because I'm here doing this podcast, but I'm only back for the summer, just kind of catching up with old friends and seeing my family, and really preparing for when I go back, because the second I get back I have an audition for our orchestra, and if our school offers this, it's quite cool, but if I do very, very well, then I get to play with the LSO. I get to do a few concerts with them, the London Symphony Orchestra, so that would be incredible, but don't want to get ahead of myself. But so I'm living in London still. I've got another year left after that, and this year I need to start auditioning for professional orchestras, which is already kind of strange, but
do you have any top picks that you would say this is my ideal future, or do you have more of a broader idea of like, okay, whatever comes?
I mean, I could say like the Berlin Phil, but that's shooting for the stars. But in a way, it's strange because we don't really have a say. I could end up in any city in the world, and it doesn't really matter in a way, because when a job comes up, you audition, and if you get it, then you take that job, or you don't, depending on where it is, and you really don't get a say, because there's so many other bass players that are auditioning for all these other jobs as well, that you just you get what you get, really.
If you're not actively looking, or actually I should say, if you are actively looking to get a seat in one of these institutions, is it common to have openings every so often, or is it more of a waiting game? I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you didn't get a job or the job that you wanted, are you bound to have to wait until the next opportunity, or is it like, okay, well, this one didn't work, I'll apply for this other place?
Well, for that, if you want a job with a particular orchestra, if you don't get it that first time, then it's going to be quite a while until another job comes out. But there are jobs opening kind of all the time, all over the world. And some of the bigger jobs are held by people who have been working for 20, 30 years. And it's a little bit dark, but it's kind of like you have to wait for someone to die in order, or not die, but retire, or, then the principal jobs in a lot of these massive orchestras will open up. But then it's a feeding frenzy. It's when a principal job anywhere really opens, the best bass players in the world are all going to be there, and so it's quite a fierce competition in order to get those spots. But there's always work, especially in smaller orchestras. They're constantly looking for bass players. But I suppose another issue is lots of orchestras are running out of funding, out of money, and are closing or cutting down their season. They're making not playing as much, not offering as much pay to their musicians, and so that's a whole other issue in itself. But sorry, I'm not sure. That's
good information to know, especially for an audience or public that might be interested in following that career path. Which leads me to ask you, if whether it's something that you're doing now or intend to do, or have done, but if you're not currently working in that sense of the word, what are some of the typical things that you have the ability to do, either on the side or as a side project, or simply just to compensate for either off season, or just not working for a full month or something like that?
I mean, I don't know exactly what the situation is here in LA, just because I spend most of my time in London. But in London, I'm able to gig quite frequently. So there's just amateur orchestras that are you know, they need players to do small concerts, and you know, you take small. It's not the most. It's not the best paying, especially relative to what some of my like jazz musician roommates are making from one night out. It's, you know, we'll have two days of work for maybe like £100, and they're doing like 300 in one night just for a set at a wedding or something like that. Because I don't know, especially well with you know, string players, right? Violists, cellists, and violinists. You can make a quartet, and you'll play. Wedding gigs are they come up all the time, and you know, people always need string quartets to do things, but they don't need string quintets to do things. So we're often,
you have to push somebody out.
Yeah, well, we you know, you don't really need a bass player for that sort of thing. So it's in a way more difficult, but that also gives bass players especially the opportunity to cross genres, because if you can play electric and if you can read, you know, charts, then you can do those jazz gigs. But you know, there's a lot of competition with that as well, and a lot of people who are all freelance musicians who are all looking for those kinds of things. But
and you brought up that your roommate is more on the jazz.
Oh yeah, no. So I live with three other students at the academy, two of whom have just graduated. But they're all, you know, two of them are sax players, and one of them is a jazz bass player who I've known for a very long time, as a close friend. But one of them has just dropped an album, Quinolton, Oulton, called Quinolton. It's great.
Self-titled.
Yeah, self-titled, but it's great. I love it, absolutely. And I think it's great living with jazz musicians, because it just gives you kind of a whole other appreciation for, you know, an entire other side of music that most classical musicians don't have, you know. Like I was talking to some violinists ages ago, and one of the things that they were saying was like, my contemporary composer friend was asking them, have you heard this or this piece or that? And they're like, if it's not like solo violin repertoire, no. I only listen to like what classical music I have to. And I think that's not great. Yeah. You know, you should, in a way, try to listen to as much as you can, and always kind of keep an open mind about that sort of stuff. And there's something to be learned from every genre of music, even if it's, oh God, I hate, you know, Taylor Swift. I mean, it's usually what not to do, but sorry to any Taylor Swift fans out there.
Yeah, I understand. That's actually a good point, because, you know, I feel like I was saying before, you know, other instruments or other genres have, in a way, you know, I'm not trying to be unfair to one instrument or the other, but in a way there are more representations in different mediums. Meaning, you know, like if you mentioned Flea from Red Hot Chili Peppers, which, you know, has served as an inspiration to many musicians. Yeah. But it's in a way easier to follow that, where it's such a mainstream kind of artist or exposure or genre. And, you know, talking about classical music, it's, you know, a lot of the pieces are, you know, very common because they're written 100, 200 years ago, and the newer compositions are obviously a little bit more obscure references in that sense. Sure. Right? They're not getting that same kind of exposure. So I think that, you know, your comment on being able to expand or broaden your you know, musical tastes or, you know, influences are probably going to be more beneficial as a player. Which my question there would be, do you feel like listening to other genres or other techniques helps you develop new techniques yourself, or add a different type of signature to your sound? Or even if you do, you know, try to broaden your either abilities in other instruments or in what you're listening to, when you go back to the double bass, it's the same technique, like, you know, like that doesn't influence how you play? Yeah, no, I mean, I try to listen to, you know, everything and see how I can apply it in a certain way. I mean, one of the things that I've learned from living with jazz players is about time, really, and how classical musicians and how jazz musicians perceive it very differently. Because if you listen to like a piece of classical music, it feels very flowing, and it can change at any moment. It can get faster, slower, little
little stops in time and then back into it. Whereas with jazz, and a lot of, pop, in a way, pop music and a lot of, modern music today, rap especially, is everything's based on a groove, a very fixed groove. And if anything kind of slows or speeds up, it's within the context of that, like, so that the actual beats don't move. And one of the things that jazz musicians value above so many other things is one's ability to keep time, to feel that groove as a unit. Whereas in classical music, you often are given the time, having a conductor in front of you showing you where the beats are. You can be slightly behind it and it still sounds fine, because you've got so many other string players who are also playing, and you can kind of fluff around, so to speak. But I think if you took that same discipline for time, with the idea that classical music flows and has the ability to change the pace of the groove, but still having an internal pulse and strengthening that, I think, is also really important for musicians, especially classical musicians.
Good to know. What do you see yourself doing within the next 3 to 5 years? I mean, in terms of aspirations, but also possibilities within your realm. Where do you see, or where do you want to be within the next few years?
Well, ideally, I want to make music, right? That sounds quite simple, but I mean, playing in an orchestra would certainly be fun, and I would definitely enjoy that. But part of me has always kind of wanted to actually make music, to have something that I can call my own.
Composition.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And I've kind of been experimenting with that a little bit here and there. I've been doing a little bit of recording with a friend of mine, a mandolin player called Jackson Spurger, and you can hear some of that on my SoundCloud, Jared Prokop, playing tunes by Edgar Meyer, which is more folky, not really classical, but I still really, really enjoy that kind of stuff. And I'd like to make more things along the lines of that, and eventually I'd like to make an album. I think that's kind of my end game, or something that I would definitely like to do along my career path.
Do you envision that being a solo type of arrangement, or like you mentioned, either a quartet, quintet, trying to bring in other musicians to them?
Well, I think it in a way be foolish of me to try and do a solo thing. I mean, like, sure, I can market it as that and whatever, but I really, especially after spending so much time around such amazing musicians, I think everyone has their own individual sound when it comes to their instrument, especially when they're incredible at it. So I think using or having people around me help me with it and be a part of that, I think would be an amazing experience. And I think if I tried to do it all on my own, it'd be missing something. Yeah. Whereas collaboration, I think, is a great way of kind of experimenting. I'm not sure exactly what genre this will fit into, but ideally something that people will like and that I'll like, more importantly.
Yeah, definitely. That's a more important part.
Yeah.
Ultimately. Okay, well, let's. I want to go ahead and go through a little round of questions that I like to end off with, just to get to know you a little bit better, and they're meant to be a little bit quick here, but go as in depth as you'd like. So let's go ahead and begin. What is your most influential artist?
Probably Edgar Meyer.
What was the first album or music that you ever bought on your own?
American Idiot by Green Day.
Good selection. Best concert you've ever been to?
Oh, it was a Red Hot Chili Peppers concert.
Yeah, here in LA? Or?
Yeah, the Staples Center. I was quite young, so I remember it really fondly. But I remember, oh god, I went into it like not wanting to have fun because I was with my parents, and I was like, I wanted to bring a bunch of friends to this, and then it was just like the second they started playing, all of that washed away, and I was just listening the entire time. Anyway.
Cool. Who do you regret not being able to see live?
Kendrick or ghost-faced killer from Wu-Tang, because he came to London a little while ago. And a friend of mine were gonna go, but
didn't get to make it.
Didn't get to make it.
Hopefully, there's another chance.
Yeah.
Okay, I want you to complete this phrase. Music is best enjoyed
with good company.
Good. Which song and or piece, any genre, do you wish you had written?
Ooh. That's a hard one. Okay. I'm gonna go with something by the Beatles, just because that would be so like iconic. I don't know, maybe like "I Want You, She's So Heavy." I think that's
that's a good one. Not one of the
but
top chart ones, but
sure.
I thought you were gonna say Eleanor Rigby.
Yeah, Hey Jude or something.
Because of the strings. That's George Martin's fault, but
yeah.
Okay. Best and worst part of being a musician?
Practice.
Is best and worst?
Yeah. You need to. And if you don't, you go crazy. It's strange, but it's a struggle, but it's also so rewarding at times. So it's just anyway.
Good answer.
Yeah.
What instrument do you wish you could play as well as the double bass?
Oh, I wish I could play like jazz piano, like nobody's business. I wish that would be, or guitar, like one of the two. But I can play piano a bit, but not nearly as well as I want to.
You do or can. Okay. Yeah. Biggest guilty pleasure?
Kanye.
Yeah, I guess it's guilty now.
I mean, it shouldn't be. I think his music his older stuff especially is incredible. I think it's like very cohesive and it's great, but he's an egomaniac and he's crazy, so what can you do? Right. And the best advice you could give anyone? Oh, listen. Just in every respect. Like if you're playing music, listen to the people you're playing music with. If you're listening to music, listen to as much as you can and listen very intently. And I think also persistence. Like if you ever feel like you're not getting anywhere or you know what you're doing isn't working, just have the faith that kind of continuing to push forward and be deliberate with what you're doing will eventually pay off. Cool. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I think it gives a lot of insights into not only yourself as a musician, but in the music world itself. A lot of these things are topics that a lot of people don't get to experience and or hear directly from the source. So I appreciate you coming on and talking a lot about these topics. Once again, can you give us information on how people can find you, listen to your work and or projects that you've done? Right. So SoundCloud is where I'm posting most things right now. So again, just Jared Prokop on SoundCloud. Follow me on Instagram, maybe Jared Prokop. I'll post more of me playing because I haven't really done that yet. I need to do more of that, but I think it's a good way of putting myself on the spot. Yeah, sure. Just like so I'll post more of my solo playing and ensemble playing there. My YouTube is pretty dead, so if that suddenly comes up again, check it out. But if not, that's probably the best way. Well, we'll definitely send our audience there, and we'll put some links up so that everybody can have that readily available. And once again, I appreciate you coming. Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, I mean, I've enjoyed myself anyway. That was Jared Prokop, double bassist, currently studying a bachelors of music in classical double bass performance at the Royal Academy of Music in London, visiting his native LA and honoring us with his presence here at the 52blu podcast. You can find him on SoundCloud. That was Jared Prokop, Prokop. We hope you'll join us again on our next episode.